بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا مولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. السلام عليكم. Oh, I love it. Yeah. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. I just want to first and foremost thank Howard University, the MSA, Sister Nisa Muhammad, and all those who are involved in establishing a program like this. I'm serious. Alhamdulillah. We have so desperately needed to have this conversation for about a decade, right? And since we begin to see the onslaught of those who begin to attack the relationship between African Americans, the Black American, and Islam. And so with the attack of that, it becomes extremely important to set the record straight, right? It becomes extremely important for us to be able to dig into some of the roots of it, and for us to really begin to understand what is this relationship between Islam and the Black American. And so I'm just deeply, deeply honored to be in a topic like this, to be on this panel. Of course, it is beyond being honored to the point of beyond intimidation to speak after your teacher, Dr. Sherman Jackson, who has written the book, is, The Third Resurrection. But alhamdulillah, I'm honored that he would invite me to be a part of this. And so I want us to get to it, inshallah. In order for us to begin to address the question, the miracle of Islam in the Black American, as Dr. Sherman Jackson already mentioned, that it requires us to have more than just this horizontal gaze, but a vertical gaze, right? And that vertical gaze to look toward, subhanAllah, not just in terms of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is doing, but who is He doing it for, and how does that play out in our lives? And what does that mean? And so for us to begin to analyze that and to begin to look at that, we're really looking at what is the relationship between the Creator and the created. What is the relationship between the divine and the manifested? And so when we look at that relationship between the divine and the manifested, particularly in this context, we must understand all the terms, right? We must look at all the terms. And I think one of the things that, and when we're looking at the terms, we must set the record straight. Like we need to make sure that we're agreeing upon terms in general. So when we first talk about Black American, right, and this is a term that people have been wrestling with. Are we talking about the African American? Are we talking about the one who is no longer connected to Africa and they are just a unique people in terms of being Black American? Well, let's first just define Black, right? And so, because when we initially look at it from, we've all seen that movie in X where he goes and he looks up white in the dictionary and it says pure, clear, innocent, and then you go to the term Black and it was defined by other, very negative terms. But when we look at the definition of Black from the spiritual cosmos, Black means mastery, right? It means mastery. It also means it means also to be feared. It also means it not necessarily in a bad sense. It also means the one who is strong, the one who is support, the one who establishes. And it also means elegance. For example, you're familiar with this. If someone is going to get a black belt in karate, it means that they've what? They've mastered that. When someone is going to get a robe when they've become a judge, that means they've mastered the law. When you're going to have a black tie affair, it means that it's elegant. It means that you've risen to a certain level. And so that's extremely important as we begin to understand the process by which the Black American, that we arrive at this term. You following me? Y'all with me?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to make sure y'all hear me and you with me. Because when we talk about the Black American, we're talking about an experience. We're talking about a multitude of things that occurred in order for them to earn that term Black American. And actually in order for them to own it, to own their own narrative. For it to no longer be a case where to be called negative was a bad thing, but to say, teach Black man, right? Or talk about it, black woman, that became a sense of power, right? As it is also one of the definitions as it relates to power. So then when we talk about the mu'jiza, a mu'jiza or a miracle in this case, is something that is beyond the customary norm. It's something that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala suspends what normally happens, what he normally does, when water is usually wet, sugar is usually sweet, lemons are usually sour, but when an oppressed people usually sometimes fall down, right? It's kind of very similar to somebody said they tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds. Right? When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala technically says, I'm going to suspend the customary norm and what you thought was going to happen, what normally happens as a result of pressure, what normally happens when you crush something, it usually turns into powder, but instead it turned into power. Right? And so this is, when we're talking about the mu'jiza, the suspension of this norm that would create a dynamic that usually would cause people to just say, I don't believe in God at all, right? That would cause people to turn toward atheism, or that would cause people to not only have a horizontal gaze, but to have a lower gaze. That was what they were intending. And so this, but the opposite happened, right? It reminds me of that moment in Roots, you all know it, right? When he goes out, right, when the child is born, when the child is born and he goes out and he wraps the baby and he takes him, in the middle of the night and all the stuff. Y'all acting like y'all ain't even seen Roots. I mean, I'm serious. Raise your hand, you seen Roots. Okay. The rest of you need to get it. That ain't on Netflix, I think. Right, where there's this moment where, he holds up the baby and he's like, behold, the only thing greater than yourself. Right, which was huge considering he was an enslaved person. I want to take us a little bit back even before that. Because in order to begin to frame this properly, as Dr. Sherman Jackson mentioned earlier, it becomes extremely important that we don't begin a narrative based on somebody else's story. And that has happened to us where we begin to define the Black American or even the Black American Muslim experience as a reaction to the idea and the oppression of white supremacy. Right? And so when we begin to define our history, first based on slavery or based on religious reactions to white supremacy or religious reactions to slavery, Jim Crow, and we begin to do ourselves a great disservice. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, I didn't create you, right, just in the wilderness of North America. I created you and then you gathered as a soul and your soul testified that I was your Lord. And this is huge for us, in order for us to begin to, I want to take a very female cosmos perspective. I rather looked at it like just in terms of the vertical gaze, and also there's a wider gaze, right? And so in that wider upper looking gaze, even in this crust, in this soil of North America, there is an ancestral history. There is a DNA genetic memory that's important for us to just mention, because if we don't, if we would be remiss of our duties if we didn't acknowledge the prayers that were made upon the soil. If we didn't acknowledge the foreheads that were pressed and cried out to Allah, right, before the presence of Columbus and his people. So I want to back up just a little bit. And, it's really small, you guys can't see that, we won't spend too much time on it. But I actually wanted to talk about, when we talk about Muslims in America before Columbus, I want to try to go fast, right? Because I don't want to stay there. I actually want to get into the growth of it. So when we talk about the Muslims who came before Columbus, yay, that's good, there, you guys can see that? Yay, love the touch screen, love technology. All right. So the first thing thing I want to go into is that in the early 12th century, there was a map discovered, a period map that was discovered actually in Turkey. And this map that was discovered in Turkey was actually the map of a West African navigator. And the details of this particular map, which you all may be familiar with, is that the details of this particular map is that it was the first map that actually showed America with all of its mountains, its rivers, and a lot of the interior aspects of America that before this map actually had never been seen before, where this map was something that was rare of its kind. So this map actually, what we discover is that all of us are familiar with Mansa Musa, right? I'm moving fast, guys, I know, right? I'm skipping a couple people. You're like, what about him? Just hold tight. So we're all familiar with Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa has a brother by the name of Abu Bakr. And Abu Bakr basically, Mansa Musa decides he wants to be a leader. His brother Abu Bakr is like, basically, I'm a traveler, I'm a navigator. And so he actually summons a great amount of people, and they took 120 fleets of ships along with that map, and they came into America. Now, why is this important? I want you to imagine 120 fleets, big, huge boats, coming to America of West Africans, who then begin, the Mandinkan people, who then begin to settle, live here. There's a cave, in a cave in Arizona, they recently found basically some writings that until now, recently they didn't know what, they thought maybe this was Native American writing, turned out it was Mandinkan, and the Mandinkan script said the elephants are sick. Now, what is the significance of that is that elephants were not something that was unique to the North American continent. Elephants were something that were unique to West Africa, right? And so this was the beginning of some of the proof of the presence of Mansa Abu Bakr and his 120 fleets. But in addition to that, they began to find coins not only in North America, but also in South America, in Brazil, that dated back to the 11th century Mandinkan coins, as well as vases and other crafts that they began to find in the soil, giving the presence of Muslims in what we now call America on that soil. In addition to, they had also found quite a bit of documents, Sharia documents, marriage contracts, contracts about property law, things like that were written between what we would call African Muslims and Native Americans, right? And so those Native Americans, I actually have one recently on my phone, but they begin to pretty much develop not just a system of dealing, but many of them intermarried, many of them became Muslim, and so now we have several Sharia documents present in America. Right? Which is why when we get to Columbus's time, we find written in his diary, he says, basically, I am certain that I have seen a mosque on the hilltops in Cuba. In addition to the dress of the people who are present, looks like the dress of the Moors in Spain, and it just begins to kind of basically document the presence of Muslims in the Americas. And again, the significance of that is because we have to be able to set a precedence. As we're talking about miracles and we're talking about the spiritual relationship between the created and the creator, right? And so that when we first have that precedence, that genetic memory, that DNA, I don't want us just to think about it, yes, in terms of the sujood that is impressed in the sand and the masajid that were built, but also I want us to think about in terms of the adhan being called, right? Very similar to when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, he tells him, give a call. And he says, Ya Allah, there's nobody here, right? And he says, you just give the call, I will deliver it. Right? And as a result of that, we're still answering that call of Ibrahim when we go to Umrah, when we go to Hajj. So I want us to understand that when they were making that call, the adhan on the soils of America, they were calling, because remember our souls were created before we came into the physical realm. Right? And so when you see this arrival of Islam in the Black American community, there is a response, there is a call that the soul is answering. You following me? Okay. So when we speed fast a little bit, and I just want to give you a couple of books that will just help you. Africans and Native Americans, the African presence in ancient. I'm sure if you haven't heard, but they came before Columbus. I'm gonna keep praying for you. Deeper Roots. This is by our brother, Dr. Hakeem. All right, Dr. Hakeem Quick. All right. Now we want to move. These are expeditions. This is actually several of the expeditions, documented expeditions that came from West Africa into the Americas. Free people settling into the Gullah Islands, free people settling into the southern parts of America, even into Latin America. This is all before Columbus, our people are coming. Then we find ourselves in the situation where we move to the Quran in chains. And I call it the Quran in chains because what you find in West Africa, and this is extremely important, is that when they were kidnapping, we like many times when we think of the slave narrative, it really minimizes the people, because you didn't take slaves. What you took were scholars and architects and engineers and educators and mathematicians and astronomers. You took them and you enslaved them. And so that's a very different understanding as opposed to you took slaves. Because what it does is it begins to dumb down our mentality, our thinking about it, as if they were slaves to begin with, or that they were meant to be slaves. And this is important when we understand the level of rebellion that began to happen, slave rebellions were mostly by Muslims, which is why in the late 1760s, they actually passed a law making it illegal to import Muslim slaves. Why? Because they said they rebel too much. They have a spirit of freedom, and it's not easy to enslave them. In addition to, these are an intelligent people that when we try to mix them up, when we try to mix the Mandinkas with the Hausas and the Fulanis, and when we try to do that, they speak Arabic to each other and communicate. Right? In addition to, they're also communicating with some of the Native Americans on the land who know them. I recognize you when I see you. Right? I recognize the light of Islam in you when I see you. So they begin to be this collaborative relationship that they were like, basically, the Muslims are a very difficult people to dominate. Right? Particularly in this case, the West African black Muslims are very difficult people to dominate. I'm going to say that one more time. Especially for my black men, my black brothers in the audience, who just had like my wife. Lord have mercy. Black people are difficult people to dominate. I'm messing with you. Brothers ain't laughing, sisters chuckling. He's like, I'm not laughing. And so what's significant about this is that, again, when you're talking about this genetic cellular memory, right? When we see this full force, when we come later into our American experience, and you're familiar with all them, right? Ayub Suleiman Jallo, Yaro Mahmoud, Omar ibn Sa'id, Abdurrahman ibn Ibrahim ibn Soto. If not, please look them up. Take it down, copy it. There's a great book called The Servants of Allah by Sylvia Njof. There's another one by Geraldine Dinkins, both slave narratives that you can find. So just hold on to this concept of what I'm telling you about that this spirit of rebellion, a spirit of resistance, a spirit of freedom, right? That is very much connected to uniting and grabbing and holding on to other people and calling them to a sense of, we are greater than this. We belong to a master, but it's not him, right? And we do serve a master, but this is not the one we serve. And so calling to that and calling other people, this act of dawah, this act of, as I reminded you, not only is this inheritance, this we get it from Ibrahim alayhi salatu wassalam, but then it's passed on to who? The inheritance of calling people is passed on to who? Bilal. Right? The inheritance of calling people to Allah, calling people to the deen, the inheritance of that is passed on to Bilal. And I want us to understand that when we're deeply interrogating and looking into our tradition, I want us to look at why the Messenger of Allah alayhi salatu wasalam, who is divinely guided, when he makes the decision, when there are other Sahaba who were saying, Ya Rasulullah, Bilal doesn't have the best Arabic. People. He doesn't have the best Arabic, right? I know someone who he has the most beautiful voice, but he doesn't have the best Arabic. Ya Rasulullah, let me call it, right? And he says, this mantle is for Bilal. And so he elevates him. He steps on the shoulders of other Sahaba, and he is actually the only Sahaba whose feet step on top of the Kaaba. Now this precedence, we have a precedence, and then we have the challenge. And the challenge in this case, of course, is chattel slavery, right? And what that that challenge, of course, of chattel slavery as a result, of course, of Jim Crow laws and all the oppression that is connected to that becomes extremely important in terms of molding and shaping what we now define as the Black American. And so, moving on from that in terms of the lesson and the method of addressing this chattel slavery was in two parts. One, of course, as we talked about, there is the physical resistance. And just to tell a quick story, if my timekeeper will allow me, just to tell a quick story of one of our great imams, Imam Makandao, who actually, when we talk about the Quran in chains, was actually a great sheikh in West Africa. He was a great sheikh, he was a hafiz of Quran, and he said, what is happening to my students, right? That my students are being kidnapped. And so as his students were being kidnapped, he actually decided that he would have himself sold into slavery to find out where are my brothers and sisters going. So he has himself sold into slavery and ends up in Haiti. Now what's so significant about him ending up in Haiti? Is that he ends up being the teacher to Imam Boukman and Toussaint L'Ouverture, who was responsible for what? The rebellion in Haiti. Of saying that this is not my nature, that I will break out of these chains physically and particularly mentally and spiritually. That I have been taught, I have a memory of having this vertical gaze. So for a while we thought that there was a big gap between the presence of these people, the presence of slaves who came, or I'm sorry, not slaves, the presence of free people who came on their own, and then the presence of chattel slavery, and then we thought there's a long gap of Islam, but the more and more research that we're doing and finding, may Allah bless Brother Habib Rasul Miller and those who are continuing to do this work, this gap is now at about a 40 to 60 year gap. As opposed to before, we thought there was like hundreds of years, but now we're right at about a 40 to 60 year gap, and I'm sure with some more research, that's probably going to close as well. And so, when we look at the method of how we address the lesson of resistance or rebellion, then there comes this spring. And so in 1921, we have the first of, I'm talking about right now, I'm not talking about Alexander Webb, I'm talking about from the Black Muslim movement. We find in 1921, Sheikh Dawood Faisal actually establishes with him and his beautiful wife, who they call Sayyidah Khadija, mission in the city of Harlem, right? And so they have, now, what's so important about this is they're jazz musicians. Both of them are jazz musicians. And so one of the biggest calls of their dawah, as we later know, and I'm going to show you a little bit later, is that there becomes a very large amount of jazz musicians, particularly during the Harlem Renaissance, who convert to Islam. And there are just multiple articles, you can Google this stuff, there are multiple articles about the mass conversion of jazz musicians, particularly during the 1920s, right? And so they begin to establish, like, basically they have their own circles of knowledge. In addition to, they have a nonprofit they got a mosque, they got a nonprofit organization, they have multiple businesses in Harlem in 1921. Then, of course, we find not too long after that, we find, or almost similar around the same time, we find Noble Drew Ali. Noble Drew Ali, again, is about the spirit of claiming our own narrative, this spirit of claiming our own history and making sure that we are the ones who define ourselves, right? And that we're not defined by someone else's definition. And then, of course, in the 1930s, coming up, we find the Nation of Islam, the presence of the Nation of Islam, which then becomes one of the most, probably the most long-lasting, powerful in terms of from an economics perspective, from a socio-political perspective, as well as the amount of people, its dawah, its fishing game becomes one of the largest to date. Not just in terms of Muslim missions, but in terms of missions, period, in America. And the fact that it is what it is committed to is the elevation, the elevation, the education, and the upliftment of Black people. The fact that this entire movement is committed toward that, and for giving them a relationship between the created and the creator is huge. That, and then we'll be studying that for decades to come. So then I want to talk about, in my last, how many minutes I got? Flash it to me. Okay. I want to talk about the cultural, is our brother Dr. Sherman Jackson, our brother and teacher and scholar, may Allah bless him and ennoble his face and continue to raise his rank, and may Allah continually allow us to benefit and to learn from him, is that the dawah becomes something extremely important. It's not just about the method of this dawah, the method of this calling people to faith is not just about scholars and even activists. It's actually about that cultural transfusion, cultural transference. The cultural transference, in addition to people experiencing that the culture around them. What's the word you use, Dr. Jackson?
Cultural production.
Cultural production, but no, your other.
You mean the plausibility structure?
Thank you. Your plausibility structure. Right? That what is around them is being infused with the message of Islam. Now, what's key about this is we're talking about, now even though we find that with Native Americans before that, what we're now finding it is in a very culture of America in terms of its music, in terms of its language, in terms of the lyrics that's coming out. So that message is beginning to transfer to people just from that aspect. Now that's in 1920. We find that, right? And I wanted to really point this one out. This one is just so beautiful to me because you see this brother, it says jazz in Ramadan. Now this jazz in Ramadan, you would think that was happening here, right, in DC. You would think think that was the Master Muhammad iftar. Turned out, this is actually an event in Istanbul. This is an event in Istanbul where they basically have asked for a number of black Muslim jazz musicians to come and to basically to play, right, during basically what they considered spiritual music. They considered this to be the spiritual music of the Black American Muslim and found it to be beneficial. There's a whole relationship between Black American Muslims and Turkey. I'm sure you're familiar that they just recently named their embassy, the street that their embassy is on, after Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz. Here you find in this, who knows who that is? Who knows who that is in the middle? Sitting in West Africa with a turban on, playing a saxophone. A trumpet. Who is that? Who is that? It's Dizzy Gillespie. Yeah. Right? That's Dizzy Gillespie. Actually sitting in Mali, right? Sitting in Mali with his turban on, playing his trumpet. Yeah. You know, we have to begin to deeply analyze when there were movements and messages to take culture away from the Black American Muslim, that what they were attempting to do was say basically you don't have any culture, right? You have no culture, or your culture is a subculture, or your culture is invalid because it's un-Islamic. What they were doing was saying, can I please take the microphone from you because you are influencing too many people? Right? This dawah is just too effective. And so that's our brother Yusuf Latif there. All right, so we're going to move past our jazz icons, and I'm looking, and that means exactly what it says. When we look at cultural icons, especially into the 80s, late 80s, into the 90s, you have Islam, basically the infusion of Islam in hip-hop is just prevalent, right? Starting with the Poor Righteous Teachers and on from there. And it's so infused. Of course, you have a number of Black American Muslims who are, in fact, Muslim themselves. But in addition to that, beyond just those Muslims who are Muslims themselves, their influence, the Islamic influence, right, on hip-hop culture at that particular time. Everybody knows when Lauryn Hill was like, don't forget about the deen, the Sirat al-Mustaqim, right? And everybody knew Lauryn Hill was big Christian. Right? Big Christian. But yet she has multiple references to Islam. Of course, that's, for those of you who know, those of you who are about my age, that's Eric B. and Rakim. Right? And the Wu-Tang Clan. Wu-Tang. Okay. And that's our beautiful sisters who are, astaghfirullah, a pilgrimage, the poetic pilgrimage. Yeah, from the UK, the poetic pilgrimage from the UK. I want to go back to that actually for a minute. And why does it say CRT? Is because what you find in this cultural productivity, what the transference of this message is really about, is you have critical race theory actually in action. You have them addressing the relationship between race, religion, and power inside the lyrics. You have them playing it out. You have them discussing it, taking it back and forth, particularly as it relates to what was the significance of hip hop on any African American family. That was the theme, right? That was the theme music to the back of your life. You can think about any particular time, at least if you were 45 and below, you can think about any like, yeah, I remember when I was when that came out, right? I remember where I was. I remember that transition when we left from you're headed for self-destruction. When KRS-One, when that ended and it began and NWA came out next, right? We remember in the 90s when that shift happened. All of us remember when Spike Lee came, when the main character in the Spike Lee movie, who was the Muslim in Spike Lee? Radio Raheem. People, why is this significant? Because we begin to see that Muslims are so much a part of the culture. They're so much a part of the American fabric. They're so much a part of what you see on a daily basis, how you interact with them, their conversation, that the way they're actually even viewed from a media standpoint is, this is the conscious brother and sister. This is the intelligent man, male and female. This is the one who's going to bring you knowledge you never heard of, right? And even if you was like, oh, we ain't trying to hear that, right? But you knew that the voice of consciousness, even inside of popular culture at that time, was the Muslim voice, right? And we remember when hip hop battles began, the FOI would stand at the end of the stage, right? And if you said something negative on the mic, they would beat you up. Why? Because you cannot sell, you cannot brainwash or give trash to our people. There was a monitoring of the messaging of the people. There was a safeguarding, right, for how we will feed our people's mind. Right? There was a safeguarding of that culture. And so when we look at cultural influence, y'all remember this? Remember when she looked like that? Now look at it. Every look she had at that time, that's Queen Latifah. Even the fact that she decided to name, even the fact that she decided to name herself Queen Latifah, right? Every way that African American Muslim women at that time were wearing their scarves, you found that present. This was also a symbol for women, a symbol of respect, right? When it was, especially inside of the inner city, in DC, in Philly, in New York, in New Jersey, in Atlanta, if you saw a Muslim woman in hijab, black men immediately be like, "Assalamu alaikum, Queen." Right? There was a level of respect. In addition to going back to those original words, there was a deep sense of fear amongst other men that you don't mess with them.
That's right.
Right? Like, you can do whatever you want with the rest of them, but don't mess with them. Because there was a sense of something would happen to you if they came under any harm in any way. And they knew what calls to make. Right? That their brothers would come to their rescue. I'm sorry, I don't want to fast forward. I know I want to, acknowledge Nas and Q-Tip and Lauryn Hill and Q-Fool. We want to, acknowledge all. Hey! In addition to, I don't want to forget, how many of you remember when brothers was walking around not only wearing kufis, but they used to always walk around with a miswak? With a miswak. You remember that? And it usually be flavored, right? With the cherry miswak. Yeah, the chew stick. We call it the chew stick. Basically, it's the miswak. Something the Prophet ﷺ used to clean his teeth with. That these were our this was the paraphernalia. This is what we did. Whether you were Muslim or not, wearing a kufi was cool. That was what you did. Right? So, please visit Dr. Suad Abdul-Khabir's book, The New Muslim Cool.
Not new, just Muslim cool.
Just Muslim Cool, sorry. Muslim Cool, right. The New Muslim Cool. That's Hamza. Right, that's Hamza. Thank you. Okay, he's calling for his Hispanic brothers. So just to close out with this, as we talk about the miracle and the mantle, I want to start with this ayat of Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Inna fahtahna laka fathan mubina." That this is the verse that actually oftentimes is referred to the opening of Mecca. When Allah says that I have given you a clear, manifest victory. And most people think the clear, manifest victory was about his return to Mecca. But the clear manifest victory was that the Arabian society at that time was it was known for its paganism and its idolatry. And now when we look to the city of Mecca, we look at it as a holy city. We look at it as an icon of spirituality and religiosity. So what happens is that this opening, the miracle that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave the Prophet ﷺ in a very short time, was that he changed the cultural dynamic of Mecca. Is that the level of power that he had, right? The social and currency that he had was that basically they looked at the Muslims as they are the strong, they are the intellectual, they are the people to be. And so for this to come to the Black American Muslim, because everything I've just listed to you in terms of when we're talking about jazz, you're talking about a language, you're talking about a musical language that began with African Americans. There are books written about the relationship of the Adhan and Quran recitation of West Africa and the blues. Right? So this relationship between who the African American is and Islam, even in our religious behavior, was something that was imitated. How is it that at one point they were considered until now they are considered the lowest class? They are the lost found. They are the lost, forgotten, despised people. How did they go from being the enslaved people, the poor people, they no money, no jobs, Jim Crow, the one that somebody has a foot on their neck, to the people that's who we want to be like. That's who we want to behave like. That's who we want to think like. That is the intellectual mind. That is even on the street, that was considered like, that's the one who has power. That's the one who has community. And at one point it was, that's the one who has strong family. At one point it was, these are the men, like even if I can't wrap my head too long, maybe I can act it long enough so I can get me one of them. Right? That was real. It became, when I can remember when standing in the 7-Eleven, and standing there and the brother was like, excuse me, queen, how can I be down? Right? Literally the words, I need a good woman in my life. And I'm going to be jacked up, but okay. Right? I'm going to be jacked up. So the point is that there was a respect toward the women. There was a look that these are the respectable, valuable women. That if you wanted a good wife, you needed a Muslim wife. If you wanted a good husband, you needed a Muslim husband. How did this low, seemingly the lowest people become one of the most imitated people? Right? And so it leaves us with what I call the mantle. That yes, you're given a miracle, but what you do with it is key. And now we are at a time where we are at a serious, crossroads. For are we upholding this mantle? Are we transferring this miracle? Are we interacting with this miracle that Allah Ta'ala would give? Are we interacting with it in a manner that would allow us to hold on to that cultural, social currency? Or even in terms of the spirit of resistance, the spirit of rebellion. Some of us are just like, miss me with that.
Wake us up.
Right? And so it becomes extremely important again that we are the people who are saying, with us you find not just the spirit of resistance or rebellion for no reason, but the spirit of freedom. That we are the people who connect the creation to the creator.
Right.
That we are the people, as our beloved Imam Muhammad Muhammad said, that you are the Bilalian people who have the responsibility to call people back to God. This is the mantle. And it's got to be each and every one of us in this room. I'm going to leave you on the words of the Roots. Might act up, but I still can pass down. I'm using new ways to try to reach these better days. Instead of trying to take you under, I must make you wonder. I still fast, make salat, and pay zakat. I didn't make Hajj yet, but that's my next project. Living 2 lives, one of turn and one with true lies. Keeping up hope, knowing He's answering to my du'as. That's the Roots. May Allah Ta'ala bless us to maintain this miracle and to uphold this mantle. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum.